Welcome and thank you all for watching. This is one of the talks organized by Catarsi Magazine and Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, which purpose is to help us understand which is the situation after the shock of the coronavirus crisis. And I will go further and I'll say that it's not just to understand or to help us to understand, but to help us to think in a more radical way and a way that can help us to fight inequalities and to transform the world. Due to this, we have gathered with Professor Costas Lapavitsas, economist and professor in the SOAS, University of London, and one of the leading voices of the critique to the ordoliberalism carried out by the European institutions. Thank you, Costas, to be here and to accept to talk with us.
It's a pleasure, great pleasure to talk to you, and I hope we have a useful and meaningful discussion.
First of all, I would like to talk about the previous situation. The crisis caused by the Covid-19 pandemic overlaps to the consequences of a previous devastating crisis, which began 10 years ago. Will the impacts of this crisis be the same than before?
No, obviously not, because the previous crisis, in a sense, came from within the capitalist system, completely within the capitalist system. It came from the overextension of finance, a huge overextension of finance, weakness of accumulation, productive accumulation, and the combination of the two created a gigantic financial crisis in the United States, globally, and then an economic crisis across the world. So it was a historic capitalist crisis coming from the contradictions and the problems of capitalist accumulation. This one has manifestly come from an external shock. It's come from a public health crisis. So it's immediately different. However, it has hit a world economy which was already weak, which hadn't recovered properly or fully even from the previous crisis, which had continued in a state of weakness. And therefore, it has created a tremendous state of economic disturbance across the world. The current crisis also has shown that capitalism, modern capitalism, cannot deal competently with public health issues. On top of everything else, it is incapable of dealing with public health issues. So it's a combination of capitalist weaknesses that we see in the current crisis. It is also a historic crisis, but quite different from the previous one.
You have been working with a network, which is the European Research Network on Social and Economic Policy, which is devoted to understanding what you say the political economy of the COVID-19. No? As you were saying, a new articulation of global capitalism will probably emerge, no, from this after the coronavirus crisis. No? And what are the certainties do we have in that new phase of capitalism here, on what is to come? And what are the issues that you are putting on by the RNCEP, from the RNCEP?
RNCEP has been around for a while. We've been discussing issues of capitalism, particularly in relation to Europe, for quite some time. With the new crisis, things became urgent. So we've kicked into action and looked into the political economy of this crisis. And we looked into it because, as you indicated in your question, and I said before, this is a historic crisis. It comes from an outside blow, but it demonstrates the great weakness of contemporary capitalism. And it shows that the path that we've been following for the last 3-4 decades, the path of globalization, financialization, and dominance of neoliberal thinking and neoliberal policy is coming to an end. It is historically bankrupt. It cannot deal with the current needs of working people, the current needs of humanity, and this is manifest in the crisis, the COVID crisis. So we began to look into the causes of that and the possible ways out. What are the implications for working people, and what are the implications for political action to change things? One thing that I will stress here is that although neoliberalism, financialization, and globalization have been shown to be basically bankrupt by the current crisis, it would be a mistake to expect them to disappear of their own accord. This will not happen. What is likely to happen is that they will mutate. They will assume different forms. And these forms can be very, very dangerous. I will stress only one thing, and then we can possibly push it further in discussion. The striking feature of this modern contemporary crisis is, of course, the role of the state, and in particular, the nation state. We've seen an incredible reaffirmation of the power of the modern state. I don't think there's been a moment in the history of capitalism when the nation state has been more powerful than now. And I say this because people in Europe especially have been talking about the disappearance of the state, the weakness of the state being overcome by this, that, and the other. Complete nonsense. I mean, the crisis has demonstrated that the modern capitalist state is more powerful than ever. And much of what will happen in terms of how capitalism will evolve will depend on the decisions of the state and on the conflicts within the state and outside the state. And that's what we want to look at, because this has implications for economic emancipation, for social equality, and of course for political freedom, for democracy. These are issues of paramount importance right now.
But even with the reinforcement of the national state, do we have that the European institutions still have much power to decide how the states can deal with the crisis, especially in the south, for example? No, we have we have been witnessing some summits in where they are talking which kind of help can be given to the south states, for example, and it caused some frictions between states in the EU, and so there is still some importance of the European institutions, and for example, what the central bank can do or what their decisions they can have effects on what the states can do. So, what's going on? So,
okay, let me first of all say that Europe and the European Union is an exception. It's not the rule. I say this because a lot of people in Europe imagine that somehow the European Union is at the forefront of global historic world development. And what's happening in Europe is really a model for the rest of the world. And what we see in Europe is really the vanguard of history. It's easy for European people to think that, especially for European people who come from the old imperial countries. Because obviously, in the old imperial countries, in 1,000 ways, culturally and otherwise, you grow up to think that the world is your own country, that what happens in your own country is actually a model for everybody else. Let me assure you that Europe is an exception. What's happening in Europe with the European Union and with all the complications of that is not the rule across the world. The rule in the world is actually very different. It is the power of the nation state. The rest of the world is run by nation states, very powerful states in many cases, not so powerful in other cases, a hierarchy of states and a constant conflict among states. But let me come to Europe, in which, as you point out in your question, the European Union, the institutions of the European Union and the mechanisms of the European Union are indeed very important. But to understand how important they are and to understand their role right now, one must again start with the nation state. The European Union is a creation of nation states. Very much so. Nation states have not gone away. They're there. They're there. They make key decisions. And the trajectory of the European Union, the last 2 decades, certainly the last decade, has confirmed that the nation state is of crucial importance. This we've seen in the current crisis. Up to now, the crucial decisions, with one exception, the central bank, have been national state decisions. Nation states have been at the forefront, and we can explore that further. We have yet to see decisive action by European Union institutions. That is yet being planned and discussed. And it might happen only after states agree to it. What is crucial to this is that the interaction of European nation states in response to the COVID crisis has demonstrated very clearly the power of a few key states which set the terms for the rest. The reason why we see moves towards some kind of European institutional response is because France and Germany have decided that this is how we should go, because the risks to their own national interests are too great. In other words, the risks to the construction of the European Union and therefore to their own capitalist interests are too great, and they're pushing in a concerted fashion for overall integrated response. What they will get, we will see. What is crucial in this is that the South, Spain, Portugal, Greece, and so on, are very much peripheral, very much subordinate, very much following on. The state has played a key role in those countries too, their own nation states, but they are subordinate states. They are subordinate to the key states, to France, Germany, and so on. That's been characteristic of the responses so far, and you can see it in a variety of ways, I'll give you one example. State aid for industry in Europe since the outbreak of the crisis has been in the region of 2 trillion euros. It's huge, large amount of money. All of that has been given by nation states. More than 50% of it has been given by the German state to German industry. The imbalance in European economies as a result of that will become enormous. And the power of the German state will also become much bigger compared to other states. That is what's been happening in Europe. That's the reality of it. And that's how capitalism will evolve in Europe in the years to come.
So we have seen that by now, some fundamental rules of the eurozone, for example, were set apart temporarily. And what do we have to expect? That they will come back again, or we are going to a kind of ad hoc policy situation, and in that situation, it can evolve in an ad hoc way. Is the eurozone possible? No, because if they are not these rules that are made in behalf of Germany or France, for example, we can expect a eurozone, a sustainable eurozone.
Okay. It's a very good question because it goes to the heart of what we've been discussing so far. I said that the nation state has reasserted itself and sets the terms of what's happening in Europe too, within the context of the European Union. The renewed role and emphasis of intervention by France and Germany has had implications for how the institutions of Europe also work. And that's the significance of the crisis. What we're witnessing in a nutshell is basically the setting aside or the abolition of the rules on the basis of which the European Union, in particular the monetary union, have functioned for 2 decades. the Stability and Growth Pact has been suspended. State aid, which I've already mentioned, state aid control, which is very, very important, has also been suspended. The rules on the basis of which the European Central Bank works, its ability to acquire public debt and to expand its balance sheet, have also been relaxed, significantly relaxed. And of course, now we're discussing a Commission proposal to effectively to institute fiscal transfers on the basis of some kind of joint borrowing by the Commission. In other words, all the basic regulations of the EMU and the EU function have been suspended. This has got very, very profound implications, because it means, first and foremost, that ordoliberalism, that set of ideas that came from Germany, the particular type of German neoliberalism that has played such an important role in Europe, is not functioning. Ordoliberalism is about rules. And German power has itself suspended the rules. In other words, it has transformed the European Union, and the monetary union in particular, into a totality that functions on the basis of discretion and on the basis of negotiation and balance of power among nations, more openly than before. That is a very, very important development, because it confirms the extraordinary weight of the key core countries, France and Germany. They are more powerful now than at any other time. This isn't a development that favors the periphery. People who think that these developments somehow suspend neoliberalism or suspend the previous regime, and they are good for Spain, they are good for Portugal, they are good for Italy, don't understand the half of it. The lifting of rules and so on means that in the end, what will happen will be what Germany and France dictate according to their own interests. That's the implication. Now, are we going to see a return to austerity after this, or are we going to see some kind of more stable EMU? What will be the implications? I can start with EMU, and I can tell you that the implications are very negative indeed. The euro is an absurd arrangement. Everybody knows that. The euro is an absurd arrangement. It doesn't help anybody in Europe, and it doesn't help the capitalist classes of Europe either, with the exception of the German capitalist class. When the COVID-19 broke out, the euro became part of the problem. Instead of being part of the solution, it became part of the problem. What to do to save the euro became an issue immediately. So the current dispensation, the lifting of the regulations and the suspension of the regulations, basically indicates once again the historic failure of the euro, the uselessness of the euro, which will become even greater as Germany and France contest leadership in the years ahead. More pressing is whether we might see a push towards a return of austerity, say, or a return of reimposition of regulations once COVID-19 is over. We don't know when the crisis will be over. People hope that there might be a V-shaped recovery and all this. It's highly unlikely. We don't know when it might be over. But I can tell you, even at this stage, that a return to austerity, in other words, a return to the Stability and Growth Pact, in the near future would be very, very difficult. It would be very difficult because once it's lifted, it's very hard to reimpose it, and a lot of peripheral ruling classes will object to it. But it will also be very difficult because, crucially, the German ruling class doesn't want it anymore. The German ruling class is split. It's split between the exporting section, which has realized that things are untenable on this basis, and a conservative section, which is still talking about reintroducing austerity. But the exporting section has got the upper hand at the moment. And that is why the Commission proposal for fiscal transfers and for a joint borrowing policy has been accepted and pushed by Germany. It is explicitly the interest of German exporting capital that have backed this proposal, and they will be very, very powerful in the immediate period. That makes the reintroduction of austerity not very likely, not so easy. So the short answer is discretion will be the principle on which the EU will be run ahead. And that's what I see. Discretion, in other words, a power balance, negotiations, give and take. And in this context, German industry and German exporting business will play the key role.
But one point that I was thinking about is that even in that situation of strength of the, for example, or a nice situation of the countries of the south, for example, in the situation of crisis, there had been some talks about some return to a kind of Keynesian policies, or but for Greece, for Spain, for Italy, they have lost their sovereignty, for example, to issue money, and no, it have been kidnapped by for the central bank. So it puts a great difficult for these states to do the policies that should be needed in the situation.
Indeed, that's exactly one of the key problems of being a member of the monetary union and of the European Union. More of the monetary union, of course, but also of the European Union. They have lost degrees of freedom. There is no question that the peripheral countries have lost degrees of freedom. You can see that very easily in terms of the fiscal expenditures of core countries compared to peripheral countries. What is it? I mean, you can see it in Spain, you can see it in case of Italy, you can see it in the case of Greece, of course. What is interesting, however, is that, say, the Italian ruling class appears to understand that things have come to the point of no further. And all sorts of decisions have been taken to support Italian industry, for instance, domestically. How effective they will be, I don't know, but all sorts of decisions have been taken in that way. They cannot spend in the same way that Germany can, because Germany is the core country and sits on top of the pile, but they're pushing. So there is definitely a new contest emerging in Europe. In other words, a reassertion of the nation state that I already mentioned. It will not be easy to go back to any kind of ideological framework that prevailed for the last 10 years and more. The years ahead will be dominated by contest of states. You can see this in the proposal of the Commission, which has been hailed as the greatest thing since interventions were invented. Typical European exaggeration. Every time something little happens, it's presented as a vast step of world historic importance. The proposal of the Commission is serious, no question. It's serious. It's a serious step. It's not as big as people make out. The Commission will demand very little real money to be committed, and then it will borrow the base of that. It will borrow 750 billion in the upper markets. Presumably 500 billion of that will be then given as direct transfers. And 250 billion will be loans. Now, loans are loans. At the moment, anybody can borrow. That's no great, it's no, it's not a great step on the part of the Commission. I mean, at the moment, money is free. Right? Most states can borrow very cheaply. So the real question is the grants. It's not 500 billion. It's a lot less than 500 billion. Actually, when you go through it, and I've been through the technical paper, it's not 500 billion, it's less. And that's for 4 years. So if you actually look at what countries will receive, it's not nearly as big as it's being made out. They might receive up to 1.5%, 2% of their GDP per year for 4 years. So it is important, but not really telling. Why are they doing that? Why are they doing it though? Why have they agreed to it? Or so far agreed to it, the French and the Germans? Because they've been pushed by the Italians dramatically, because they've been pushed by the Spaniards dramatically, because they know that the situation is beyond the point of return almost. They know that, and they admit openly, again in the technical paper, that this policy will be good for German exporters. And it will be good for core country exporters, not specifically German, but mostly German exporters. That's the logic, and that's what we're going to see. It's not the reassertion of European solidarity. It's not the reassertion of European homogeneity. It's not any of this nonsense that keeps being peddled. It is actually nation states jockeying for position, and the dominant states dictating the terms.
So maybe we should in this picture we should think in a way to think. Well, maybe I think that we should face if the restrictions are not going to come back, or there is a weakness situation for the EU. No, the countries must think the way they have to live. Maybe or what do you think about it? Maybe we should face it in different ways. One way, for example, can be Brexit to force a referendum, or and so on. And it must be a program for the left organizations, maybe in that situation, in that stage.
Okay, we can answer this question in a broad, long-term historical sense. First of all, okay, which is a common way of the left, and it's important. You've got to look at the historical dimension and the long-term trajectory. In the long term, the European Union has got no future, certainly not the future that people think it has, and the monetary union even less of a future. So basically, in the long term, there is little doubt that these institutional alignments and institutional associations will lose content if they continue to exist. So long term, yes, of course, we've got to think of life outside these things. But obviously, in political terms, the long term doesn't tell you what you should do tomorrow, right? You've got to be thinking of the here and now. Otherwise, you never get to the long term, because the long term is a series of short terms, right? So you've got to think of the here and now. And the left must find proposals and arguments that connect with now, with the situation today. So 10 years ago or so, when the question of the euro was crucially important, my argument was get out. Get out here and now. And I argue that in Greece and elsewhere. We're not there now. That's not the issue at the moment. The issue is not to get out of the euro tomorrow. Because if you get out of the euro tomorrow, you will just make an already very difficult situation right now much more difficult. Yes, the euro is untenable. Yes, at some point, it should be replaced, and the monetary arrangements should be scrapped, and new arrangements should be brought about in Europe. But right now, we've got a COVID crisis. We've got a tremendous shock to aggregate demand, a tremendous shock to aggregate supply. The last thing we need is monetary disturbance on top of that, because that will create complete chaos. The real issue for us now, and the real issue for the left, I think, is to make proposals about effective intervention in the sphere of aggregate demand by supporting people's income, by supporting people's ability to live, and effective intervention in the sphere of supply to support the ability to produce and to meet the demand, and to do so in ways that are communally and socially and environmentally acceptable today. That's the real issue right now. Europe faces a problem of a collapse of demand and a collapse of income. And it's a devastation. Unemployment, inability to consume basic things. We need to support that. And we need to think of ideas that systematically do that. For example, some kind of proposal of a universal basic income that would support the poor and will introduce a new arrangement between capital and labor for the longer term. And at the same time, decisive intervention in supply by looking at public ownership, public control, local authority intervention, public procurement policies with a progressive dimension, communal efforts to organize communal life, overcoming, in other words, parts of elements of globalization, and all that with environmental concerns and equality concerns in mind. That's what's at issue right now. That's what's pressing. That's what we must propose the next, now and for the next few weeks and months.
But I'm thinking in economies with a huge percentage of tertialization and financialization. For example, the situation of Spain, where is a huge mass of real estate invested capital, for example, which is difficult to think in this kind of policies. And maybe one thing that must be pushed forward is and we are witnessing right now, with the shutting down of industries, or to think of a new model of economy, a new model of industry policies. That what do you think about that to change, the model of production also?
That's basically what I said. Targeted intervention on the side of supply, on the side of production. Restructure the way the economies work, rebalance the relationship between capital and labor in favor of labor, favor communal and local responses to needs and to production, bring in the question of the environment in a real sense, not greenwashing, but in a real sense of how to organize local production, coordinate the local states and local authorities to support local employment and local wealth creation with the communal framework, with communal aims. These are all feasible things. That's what is being called for. In other words, begin to change the model of neoliberal financialized capitalism in practice and from below. Because what have we got in globalization and financialization? Vast expansion of trade and reliance of countries on imports and exports. And we've created a system whereby fish are caught off the western coast of Africa. They are sent to East Asia to be processed, and then they're sent to Western Europe to be consumed. And similar examples can be multiplied across Europe, as you know. And we saw the implications of it. COVID-19 hits. We haven't got capacity domestically to produce masks and to produce ventilators, because you rely on international trade. These are made in China, or they're made wherever they are, and you rely on these countries to send them to you. So when trouble emerges, you can't deal with it. Now, clearly, we need a different model. We need, in other words, to localize what happens. We need to move away from hyper-globalization and all the nonsense that goes with it, because it's not efficient. That's not how societies want to live. So you need policies that do precisely what I mentioned before. Communal concerns, local concerns. Let's reroute production. Let's start making things again. In much of the southern periphery of Europe, we've forgotten how to make things. We rely on services, we rely on tourism, we rely on various other bits of service provision, and we haven't got capacity to make screws and to make basic things. Society should not live that way. So we need indeed an alternative model that relocalizes production and gives it a communal and social dimension. And similarly for finance. What's the benefit of all this globalization of finance, this huge spread of the global financial system with the export of capital freely across borders and even within Europe? What's the immediate benefit of that? It's very hard to see in terms of growth and development. We don't need that. We need different kind of finance that takes local and national needs into account, and it is mobilized to serve these purposes from a communal and social perspective. That's what we need to be intervening for and to be arguing for. That will also bring the European Union, the European Monetary Union into account. Don't worry about it. As soon as you start dealing with these things, the nonsense of the European Union as it stands and the nonsense of the European Monetary Union will become very, very apparent.
But in doing so, we need a program, no, step by step, because I am thinking, for example, in the commercial war between USA and China and the attempts to relocalize the production, the industrial production in the United States, and the troubles they had, for example, because the markets were so interlocked that it was so difficult to just to just depend on the local industries. So I think that what are you saying is that we have to look at that as an horizon, but maybe we should have a program to work it step by step.
Of course. Let me just stop this.
Yes.
Just a minute. Hello? I'm in the middle of an interview. Let's talk a little bit later. I'm in the middle of an interview on Skype. All right. Okay, say the question again. I'll do it.
No, it was more a reflection. That it's difficult when the globalization is so expanded and the markets are so interlocked, and it's not clear. Which comes first. If a new kind, or maybe it's just to put into a program and to think how it goes. But it's difficult to think if we should maybe first trying to quit the European Union or to quit in the eurozone and its treaties, and at the same time reinforcing our economy or changing our models of production to meet the people's needs. And maybe, in doing so, we should think in a kind of cooperation for example, in South Europe. There had been ideas about to set this kind of political strategy, like, for example, some similar idea was carried out in Latin America, in the ALBA, for example, and there are some organizations and some voices that they had been thinking in doing the same thing or a similar thing in Europe. What do you think on doing so? Because in the previous crisis, there was a different timing of the state response, but now, the coronavirus has impacted in the same time, and states are facing the same problems in the same moment. So maybe it's a situation that ideas like this can be put forward in many different things, and many different places. Sorry.
You're more optimistic than I am. But
no, it's just to think forward and to think.
Let me say two things.
In a further way.
Yeah, let me say two things. First of all, one must not exaggerate the strength of the links that have been created by global trade and global capital flows, and the difficulty of reversing that. For capital flows, we know it's clear. The minute there is any threat, they go back. They reverse direction themselves. So it's not, we know this is just, it can happen any minute. But even for trade, it's a long-standing phenomenon in world capitalism. Because, of course, the world market did not emerge yesterday. The world market has been about for 2 centuries now. It's a long-standing phenomenon. And I mean the world market is an organizing integral whole. Obviously, international trade has been in existence for many centuries, but the world market as an integral whole has been in existence for 2 centuries now. It's happened many times. People argue, oh, we've reached such a state of integration, we cannot go back. Well, history shows that you can easily go back. We've seen it time and time again, right? First World War, the interwar years, and so on, after the Second World War and what have you. So trade is not as much of a bond as it is. And obviously now we've got internationalization of production as well, not just trade. And internationalization of production creates its own requirements and logic. Things are being made across the world. But even that, we know it's nonsensical in many ways, and we want to reverse it. We want to be creating things where we live and where we are, and we want to put things in place to restart that process. So let's not exaggerate how difficult it is. But let me come to the second part. Yeah, indeed, we need a plan. We need a plan in stages with coherent ideas and coherent proposals. Because opposite us, we will have established interests, very powerful interests, financial in the first place, but not only. If you look at the big business that we're faced with in Europe, the most powerful elements of it is German industrial capital. It doesn't want any change. It doesn't want any change. It wants things to continue because there are a lot of very rich people in Germany, which has become very unequal as a country the last 3 decades, who don't want any real change. They want the management of the situation so that things continue the same and they can continue to make that profit. If you look at the situation globally, you've got hugely powerful monopolies, Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, and so on. They don't want change. Apple wants to continue to create its products in 55 countries across the world and draw rents from left, right, and center. That's what he wants to do. So this will be opposed. So we need a plan. We need a strategy. We need industrial proposals for industrial strategy. We need to be patient, and we need to be putting on the table ideas that are doable. Now, in that context, collaboration between Southern European states is such a nice idea. I wish it were possible, because obviously, during the eurozone crisis, we saw anything but collaboration. What we saw was intensified competition among southern states, most of which wanted to say, I'm actually not like the other southerners, I'm like the northerners. You shouldn't be putting me in this category because I'm a serious country, unlike the others. So that's not basis for cooperation, and that's not basis, no basis for collaboration. Nothing happened. When you look at the current situation, which is of course different to the eurozone crisis, because as you say, the shock is simultaneous and symmetric in a way. It has hit everybody in the same way. Don't forget, these are service economies and with very, very weak industrial base and very small capacity to generate jobs in the private sector. They used to rely on the public sector to create jobs, and that has been constrained because of the policies of the European Union. Mm-hmm. So these economies rely on services, and these services include tourism, and they compete against each other often when it comes to these services. So I would not be that optimistic, because the ruling elite in each of these countries will see other ruling elites and other ruling classes as competitors. The idea that they can cooperate and stand up against the Germans or the French and so on doesn't persuade me with any kind of confidence. Or the idea that they can create a separate set of institutions that will allow them greater cooperation within their economies. I find very little material foundations for that. Unless there's a political change, of course. Unless there's a political change from below. That's a different story.
Of course, I was thinking in a program that of cooperation lead from the left, or not by the actual ruling classes, which are very comfortably in that situation of touristification and service economy, which is being the
I'm not sure how comfortable they are in that, because they themselves realize that they're losing out. And one of the biggest mysteries, less so for Spain, but more for Portugal, say, or Greece, is why the ruling class accepts it. Because, say, the Greek ruling class has accepted a decimation of the Greek economy. The Greek economy, in terms of its presence globally, Greek capitalism, in other words, Greek capital, in terms of its presence globally, used to be two things: banks and shipping. These were the main areas of economic activity in which they had a global role. There were a number of other things, but they were smaller, right? Banks are finished in Greece. They've been decimated. Shipping has been very severely affected. And the rest of economic activity has been devastated. So from the perspective of the Greek ruling class, the last 10 years have been a disaster. And yet they acquiesce, they accept. They accept their subordinate role, and they've got no other vision. So even it's a mystery why they're behaving that way. But of course, we're in full agreement then, if you put it that way, that the prospect of cooperation is very, very important, genuine cooperation in the South, and that can only come from below. It will not come from the top. It will come from us. It will come from people of the left who will put doable projects and proposals on the table, who will mobilize and create political change. And on that basis, yes, we can think of ways in which the southern periphery can begin to support each other and can begin to exchange ideas, technology, people, resources, and so on, to strengthen employment and to strengthen income in the South, because the South is falling behind. There's no question. The South is falling behind even as we speak.
Okay, just to finish, because we have been here for maybe an hour. No, just if you want to add something, but I think that now to conclude, the idea of that we have a plan, and a plan regarding the nation state, and not looking to all the time to change European institution, like some other voices are stating. Maybe it's a kind of shift that maybe we have to learn from this coronavirus crisis. I don't know if you agree.
I can tell you what I think, and I can tell you what is the direction of analysis on the part of RNCEP, the work that we've been doing. From my perspective, it is very important for the left and for countries in the periphery to begin to act now in the face of COVID-19 as if Europe did not exist, meaning European Union did not exist. It is of paramount importance that action is taken quickly to prevent the devastation that's emerging, to strengthen domestic economies, to strengthen employment, to strengthen societies and communities before it is too late. The blow is enormous, and waiting for Europe, whatever that is, to appear and save the South or save other communities and societies is nonsense. This will not happen for reasons that we've discussed. So it's of paramount importance, and that's the obligation of the left and of radical forces to argue it. We need action in the here and now that starts from where we are, that is based on our own strength, it's based on our own resources, it's based on our own forces, and begins to deal with the problems of our own societies. We don't look to Brussels to save our problems. This will not happen, right? We look to where we are, where we live, and begin to mobilize and organize. It is of crucial importance for countries in the periphery right now, first and foremost, the southern periphery, to act in that way. With this mental and political framework, and with corresponding political sources and social forces in place, then we can think of new policies, industrial policy, financial policy, rebalancing economies and societies in the interests of labor, in the interest of equality, in the interest of progress, in the interest of social progress and democracy. In other words, popular will from below. This is what is the issue at the moment. That's the paramount issue. And COVID-19 has made it as pressing as at any time I can remember it.
Okay, thank you very much, Costas, for this talk. And I think we have a lot to think about and to start to act. Thank you very much.
I thank you, and I look forward to further discussions in the future.